Good evening. Welcome to today's BIC Streams. Storytelling Women, Anita Nair in conversation with Kamini Sawhney. For those of you who are here for the first time, just a few announcements. If you are not on our mailing list or don't follow us on any of our social media channels, do sign up. You can ask questions to the panelists of today's session by typing in your questions in the Q&A box. The bios of both panelists will be available in the chat box that you can see below. Both of them are below your screen. YouTube viewers can type in your questions in the comment section, and we will make sure that they are asked in the room right here. So this conversation is part of a three-part series of conversations with women in the arts, and Kamini will tell us more about that. Over to you, Kamini.
Thank you, Raghu. Good evening and welcome to MAP's Women in Art and Culture series. We're delighted to be back with our public lecture series in collaboration with the BIC. And what better time than the present for all of us to come together to navigate these challenging times and to focus on the impact that art has had on our lives and perhaps its ability to help us heal. So this evening we are talking to Anita Nair, one of the most defining faces in Indian writing in English. She has made reading one of the most pleasurable journeys for so many of us. And what constantly amazes me is her whole range of skills. Children's books, historical novels, crime fiction, poetry, the list is endless. And all the while, refusing to be restricted by labels that slot her into a particular kind of writer. So this evening, Anita is going to unpack her journey and her process for all of us. But before she begins, I'd just like to explain to our audience how we have planned the evening. So Anita will present her thoughts for the first maybe 10 or 15 minutes. And after that, we'll begin the conversation with her. So all of you, please send your questions in. There's a Q&A button on your screen. So please type your questions in and I will pass them on to her and she will answer them. So keep the questions coming in. Let's have an interactive and interesting discussion this evening. So Anita, it's over to you now.
Good evening and thank you, Kamini, and thank you, Ravi, and thank you everybody else at BIC who's made this wonderful evening possible. You know, I thought I was going to go through the lockdown without doing a single webinar. And then suddenly last week it began and this is my second one already. So it's a little daunting to kind of talk to a screen, but well, we have to try everything once, they say, except Morris dancing and incest. So I'm going to start off by talking to you about, the questions that come to me very often when people read my work and they want to know, so what comes first? This is the question I get. What comes first? Is it the story, or is it the character, or is it something else? So ever since I can remember, what has always triggered a story for me is something happens. There's something that all of us as human beings are engaged with the world around us. And there's something that happens. It could be a personal occurrence in my life. It could be something that's happened in the world around me. It could be something that is common to the human condition and draws from that. And when that happens, that abstract, because I don't have a name for it at that point, that abstract stays in my head and I'm constantly worrying it. I'm constantly trying to understand more about that particular issue or the particular problem or that particular theory. And as I start thinking about it, it's a long germination process. And at the end of the germination process, I know the end of the germination process has happened when out of the blue, something occurs that is related to the story. It could be a scene, it could be an object, it could be anything. So what I thought is I would try and explain it to you through the context of my own books. my first novel was The Better Man. Now, I never set out to write a novel when I started writing The Better Man. I had just finished publishing a collection of short stories, and this book had been kind of, I would say, had lodged itself in my head, as in I wanted to write about the village that I come from in Kerala. However, I kept thinking that, maybe I would do it at another time. And then my parents, who had relocated there after my dad retired from the government service, my parents had gone back to our ancestral village and they built a house and they started living there. And they didn't really enjoy it because much as, most urban people like to believe that villages are perfect places, they can be terrible places and they're very closed communities. So any outsider is not welcomed with open arms. Even if that person is from there, he or she is not welcomed with open arms for a long time. People need to start trusting you, etc. So there was a kind of period when my parents were not very happy living in that village. And they kept talking about, selling up and moving away and going away. And I was heartbroken because I had kind of pushed them into relocating into the village. And I had always felt I belonged. They didn't feel they belonged. And this is a village that my family goes back by several hundred years. So I felt like by selling up, we would be severing ties with what was our past. And I decided that I was going to write a chronicle. I wouldn't even call it a novel. It was just going to be a chronicle of the village. It was just going to describe the places and some of the characters that I had met, the people I had met there, some of the rituals, customs, beliefs, etc. The plan really was for me to create a kind of journal, which at that time my son was really small. And I thought if someday my son was to ask me, where did we come from? I was just going to give this journal to him and say, read this. So I started writing this journal. I wrote a chapter. And at some point, it hit me that what am I doing chronicling a village when I have a novel that should be written here, set in this place? And so I started writing The Better Man like that. So you see, it began with a place. It didn't really begin with a character or a story. Now, for instance, with Ladies Coupe, it was a completely different experience. I had, I was writing The Better Man and I'd finished writing it. And during those times, I used to constantly travel to Kerala, back and forth from Bangalore. And very often I would just decide to catch a train on Friday night. So, I would leave work a little early, go to the railway station, buy a ticket, go home, pack and board the train. Now, obviously, in those times, until 1997, if you went to any railway station in India, I think even later in some other railway stations, you would always find a line which said, it was a queue, and they had this alphabet Q written out there. And on top of it, there would be this three phrases: ladies, senior citizens, handicapped persons. And, like every other woman, I would go and stand in that line, but something in me would kind of feel very, very debilitated by being part of that line. I'll explain why. I understand that senior citizens might not be able to stand that long, especially since our queues are very long. And secondly, probably again, a handicapped person cannot stand there for that long. So I understand the need for a special queue for them because, each one of the other lines would have a minimum of 30 to 40 people. And what I discovered in the ladies' queue was that women would be standing in the place where they're expected to stand, but adjacent to them would be a husband or a brother or a father or a son or somebody who is merely using the woman as a prop to save the place, in the line. And I would stand there and something in me cringe and cry and everything. And I would think that one day I need to write about this. And so while I was working on The Better Man, I'd already started thinking of Ladies Coupe, but I didn't know what form it was going to take. But I, finished writing The Better Man, and it started, going into the publishing process. At which point I was diligently working on Ladies Coupe, or at least thinking about it. And then one day, I was still working then. I was working in advertising. I remember going to work, and I had a junior copywriter work with me at that point, and she is one of the nicest people I've met, and she is this really sweet girl, and she was also to a large extent the provider in the family. And yet, if she needed to stay back late, or if she wanted to go out for a movie, or go out and hang out with friends or whatever, she had to ask permission at home. And she had a curfew. She was not allowed to come home after 7:30. And it kind of again bothered me that here is this girl who is independent, she's responsible, she is a very smart girl, and yet her family would like to treat her like as if she is a subhuman who needs that kind of monitoring all the time. And I remember when she was telling me this, and this was at work, so I was really bothered. And about half an hour later, I used to write longhand. Then I continued to write longhand. So I used to even do my advertising work longhand. And I had a notepad and a pen, and I started just writing. I just started writing, and that was how Ladies Coupe began. So out of the blue, this is character who appeared in my head, and all I knew was her name was Akhilandeshwari, and and mistress of the universe, but she is absolutely mistress of nothing, and that's what her name says. But in truth, she's mistress of nothing. So now, when I finished Ladies Coupe, it was a book that was received hugely and wonderfully in various parts of the world, and it suddenly changed uh, who I was as a writer and who I was perceived to be as a writer. And I was being lionized greatly. And back of my mind again, because I'm always having this conversation in my head with myself in my head, and back of my mind, I was asking myself, are these people telling me that I have written a good book because the world tells them that? Or do I really think that I have written a good book? So this is a question that was beginning to pop its kind of worrying head all the time in my thoughts. Am I really a good writer? Or do I think I'm a good writer because the world tells me I am? I had to kind of make it very precise for myself. And again, I started thinking, and I had a thought in my head, because in that previous agency that I'd been working in, I remember one day that a Kathakali dancer had been brought there. I remember walking up the steps. It was a narrow flight of stairs, walking up the steps, going into the lobby, which was not more than about 6 by 6. And there was this Kathakali dancer filling up almost the entire space of the lobby. And the rest of my colleagues standing by the doorway and gaping and giggling. And, we didn't have cell phones then, so there were no pictures taken. And everybody was gaping and, looking at this man and everything. And then he made a few mudras, and then he was bundled away and taken away in a Tata Sumo, and they left the place. So I went back in and I said, what was all that about? And they said, oh, this was, a rate card. For many of you who don't know, a rate card is what media publications would send out at one point of time. And this was basically saying what was the cost of an advertisement in that particular publication, and how much what they would get, and what's the kind of reach, etc. So some upcountry publication had decided to use a Kathakali dancer as a gimmick to make the visibility even more stronger, and so that the media planner would remember this particular publication when he was doing his media plan, etc. And it kind of that broke me really, because this man had been reduced to being a puppet. And now, as a Kathakali dancer, has to study a minimum of at least 8 to 9 years before he can actually perform on the stage. There's a kind of equation that they say, like, 100 hours of practice for 1 minute on the stage. And this is post after studying everything that you've studied. So this man, I'm not blaming him. This man will, because obviously there are very few opportunities for him to do what he must do to earn a livelihood. And this question came to me about what does he feel like having to do this? And the question that was there in my head began to kind of blossom. And this question was, what is artistic success? Is artistic success something that an artist realizes for himself or herself? Or is artistic success something that the artist believes he or she has because the world tells him or her that they are phenomenal artists? So I had this thought in my head, and I knew I wanted to set this story within the world of Kathakali. But where was I going to begin? And then I was, again on a train back to Kerala, and I got off at the station that I usually did, which is a station called Shoranur. I got off there, and as I was walking and I, was coming down the overbridge and coming down the stairs, I suddenly had this epiphany. I had this image in my mind of a foreigner, a white man, standing with a cello case next to him in that crowded platform, and 3 people coming down the staircase that I was coming down. A young woman, a young man. When I say young, I'm talking of early 30s, and a much older man. And that was all I had in my mind. These 3 people and this young man waiting on the platform. And it became a process where I had to tell the story to myself to understand what was this strange combination of characters doing in a railway platform in Shornur, which is a small junction town and has nothing much, to say for itself, except that it's next door to a place called Kalamandalam, which is the place where Kathakali is done. So as you can see, there are many ways that a character can creep into the story. There are many ways. Sometimes a place can create a plot, and then I as a writer, as a creator, I fill it up with characters. I think now perhaps I should open the room for Kamini and anybody else. And thank you, Kamini.
Okay, thank you for all those insights, Anita, because as a reader, when I finish the book, I'm always dying to get to the author and say, why did you make this character do this? What did you have in mind when you did that? And I remember when I met Kiran Desai, after I read The Inheritance of Loss, the first question I said is, why did you do that to the dog? Why did you allow the dog to be kidnapped? And she looked at it and she said, yeah, that was really a sad incident. It was like she had no control over it either. So I was quite intrigued by that. But let me come back to a question that I think is really important. And that is, do women writers always carry the burden of having to write about women's issues while men are free to write about humanity at large? And I do agree that a whole range of female experiences are not explored by writers. And so the sisterhood is very anxious to get it out there and to lay it out there, and anxious for other women writers to do that. Have you ever felt the pressure of that and felt that there are other stories locked inside you that are difficult to get out because you have to get these stories out first?
Well, there is that pressure that because I'm a woman, I'm very often I'm told that, oh, your women are so much more stronger, are so much more better than your men. But I don't believe that. I really like to think my male characters are just as strong and powerful and just as wicked and whatever, and whatever that they can, that there is absolutely no gender in bias, really, the way that I create my characters. I create a character who is necessary to take the story forward. And it's not that I have a female or a male character and then use them to use them to, like props and move them this way and that way. No, it's not that at all. It's basically that and I've always said this, I'm a storyteller and more than a novelist, because for me, it's very important that the story is supreme. The characters are what make the story alive. But there is a story, there is a fundamental truth that I'm trying to explore in each one of my books. And so I sometimes feel that gets bypassed, that the fundamental truths that I'm trying to explore and share is somehow kind of bypassed for this whole thing of needing to compartmentalize me or pigeonhole me and say that, yes, Anita writes, is a woman's, is a writer who writes about women. And that somehow seems bloody unfair to me, really.
I know. Well, since you're talking about characters, you've created some iconic characters like Idris, the Keeper of Light, and I must call out here Inspector Barigauda, because you have described him as your alter ego. And Inspector Boregauda, for a lot of people who don't know him, is this hard-drinking, bullet-driving, bucking the system kind of guy. So what is all this that Inspector Gowda is doing that you're longing to do? Tell us how, you created him.
So, okay, there's a very interesting story there. So I had just finished writing, Lessons in Forgetting had appeared in Europe, in about 3 countries. So I was doing this European tour, talking to, book clubs and readers and press, etc. So it's been kind of crazy, like 3 days is here, 4 days there, that kind of thing. And at one point, my son joined me on that journey. And book tour, that's the official word. And we were sitting at a cafe this sounds very, very kind of la-di-da, but we were sitting in a cafe in Rome and drinking hot chocolate. And I said, Maitreya, I'm, kind of a little weary of answering about the women's condition in India, much as I want to talk about it. When you've been answering the same kind of questions over in 3 different countries, I'm not answering them in 3 different languages, I'm speaking them in English. But, I hear an interpreter say it in Spanish, in Italian, in French, etc. And I know that I'm repeating myself again and again. And I said, oh, I'm a little weary of talking about the women's condition in India. And so I think on a lark, and maybe he was being facetious or something, he said, why don't you write about a transgender, And I actually looked at him and said, yeah, good idea, maybe I will. And then we walked across the road to one of those bookshops where I, found a beautiful stationery section there. And I found this wonderful notebook, and I bought it and I took it back with me, and I had absolutely no idea what I was going to write. And I just started writing something. So this is the first scene in the first novel of Cut Like Wound, which is a man dressing up as a woman. And I suddenly had this scene. I had a scene written down. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. And then I had this image in my mind of this policeman on a bullet. I like bikes. I can't ride or drive or anything, but I love bikes. I'm sure that if I were to be born again, I'll be like one of those Hell's Angel bikers. So, so there's this. So I had this image of this man on a bike and somebody who is like, not the kind of conventional policeman that you see, and at the same time, he's very local, He's not like, he's not a kind of Indian version of, say, Rebus or Wallander or any of those people. No, he's not that. He's very much a product of the place that he's from, the system that he's part of, etc. But this guy is someone, like probably you and me, grew up in Bangalore, went to good schools and colleges, traditional in many ways, not so traditional in other ways. I know so many people like that. And this guy actually joins the police because he really wants to do good. But obviously the system kind of grinds his nose in the dust. And so he becomes this very cynical kind of a guy. And the only joy he has in life is his bike, whom he even has a name for, and his old monk. Now, again, the old monk is an interesting thing. So because I like whiskey, I'd said like, okay, he'd drink whiskey. And then there's a friend of mine who said, excuse me, you don't know Bangalore cops, they're not going to be drinking whiskey. So we were sitting in Koshi's, and we called one of the stewards there. And I said, look, tell me something, do cops come in here? And he said, yeah, of course. And I said, so what do they drink? So he said, they drink Old Monk. And I was like, okay, fine, this is research. So the thing with the cop stories is that I wouldn't be able to create those stories if I didn't do all the research I did.
Okay, I'm going to jump in here because because I can see this discussion going where I think a question fits in from one of our viewers, Smita. And she asks, settings are vividly described in your work. So does it emerge on its own as the characters are built up?
No, I'm somebody who's very observant. And in fact, in all the writers I mentor, I tell them it's very, very important to kind of keep a note of your setting. If possible, look at maps, look at pictures, all of those things. So it needs, thing is, to the writer, the place is very vivid in their minds, but the reader may not see it so. So the reader has to be taken through that whole process of seeing that place.
Okay. So I actually really wanted to ask you about so many of your stories set in Bangalore, because I'm sure there are many reasons for you setting that, and some of them I can see Shivaji Nagar also coming up in many of your novels. But to me, the city almost emerges as a character, and in Chain of Custody, you can really see the dark underbelly of the city. So it's almost as if Bangalore is the kind of antagonist in the story. So how do you use the city in the ways that you write as a sort of subtext through it?
So so pretty much all the books that I have written have been, they've been set either in Kerala, Tamil Nadu, or Bangalore specifically. The reason being that these are the three places I know well enough to write about them. I know the culture, I know the customs, I know the language, all of those reasons. I know that I can get into the grain of the story rather than just kind of make it very superficial. So, but with the Inspector Gowda novels, I knew that the city was going to be as much a character as Inspector Gowda himself. So I, started looking at what parts of the city am I familiar with. I've lived in Bangalore for almost now 30 years, but I still am very, very unfamiliar with, say, Jayanagar, JP Nagar, Malleshwaram, etc. I know what is called the cantonment area of Bangalore pretty well. And since I lived in closer to Coxtown, Cooktown, Frasertown, that little triangle there, Shivaji Nagar was something that we went to all the time to, do the shopping at Russell Market, or sometimes, for whatever reason, just wandering around and stuff like that. So I was very sure that I wanted to celebrate Shivaji Nagar as a place in this book. And so I decided that my area was going to be Shivaji Nagar and Hennur and all those areas, because again, these are areas that I'm familiar with. And I wanted to show how the city had changed. And it's easier doing that in the outskirts of the city rather than within the city, because many of the old buildings are not going to move in central Bangalore or the CBD area. It's just, one building is going to be replaced by another. But if you really want to see how change has occurred in Bangalore, you need to go into the outskirts to see how those open fields have all been taken over by buildings. And when buildings and real estate and construction comes in, then there is a second city that is coming along with it, which is the migrant worker. So I wanted to talk about all that. So which is why Bangalore became not a, I wouldn't call it an antagonist, but I would definitely call it like a key character of the novels.
Yeah, what you actually were trying to show is that the real estate boom had in fact accelerated the whole thing of trafficking in minor girls, right?
Yeah, you see, once upon a time, Bangalore was just a transit point for trafficking. Today, it's one of the hubs, because there's so much of demand, and human life has no value at all. But as a commodity, it has a great deal of value, and the perversity of people takes different forms. And if they have the money to pay for it, there are people willing to supply it.
Okay, there's Cora here who wants to know, very often the love stories you write about end sadly. Is love hopeless?
I won't say love is hopeless, but one of the things that I remember a friend of mine telling me a long time ago was that every relationship has an expiry date. So it's an organic thing after all. It's not plastic.
Okay, so let's talk about Sri Lakshmi from your latest book, Eating Wasps. The book begins with her suicide, and you actually have her lover Marcos come in when at the funeral pyre at the dead of night, who picks up her index finger and walks off with it and puts it into a velvet-lined box in a cupboard where it's locked away. And it's so sad because Sri Lakshmi then cannot ever be completely free of this world because there's that little part of her always kept here. And so she sort of wafts as a ghost through all the stories that come up in that. So tell us a little about this character of Sri Lakshmi.
So Sri Lakshmi is actually very, 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 very loosely based on a real life writer in Malayalam literature called Raja Lakshmi, who was also a college lecturer. And she also, nobody knows why she killed herself. She did kill herself, but nobody knows why she killed her. She's a very well-known, successful writer. She was young, and her works were celebrated. And she was the first person to receive the Kerala Sahitya Academy Award, etc. And the youngest. And, you would think that she had everything going for her. She was single, but she was independent, and she had a steady job. She had a thriving literary career. And then one day out of the blue, she killed herself. And there was no knowing why she killed herself. And this kind of intrigued me. And to this day, Raja Lakshmi is still celebrated in Malayalam literature. And I remember going back to Kerala about some 3-4 years ago, and this was her 50th anniversary or something like that, death anniversary or some particular year, commemorative year. And my local library there was doing this big do there. And I was like, this lady has been gone for so long, and there's so many living writers around. So what is this magic, this spell that she's cast over all these readers after even so many years? So I started wanting to read more about her. So there's nothing at all about her. If you went and did a Wikipedia search, you'll find 3 lines about her exactly. So I then started reading her novels. I read Malayalam, so I started reading her novels. And as I read them, I realized that this was a very, very unhappy woman. As a writer, sometimes there are things that writers can sense. It's like a musician being able to sense when another musician uses a particular note in a certain way. So there's a kind of innate instinct that kind of comes into play. And I said, let me try and write about her. But I didn't have enough material, and I didn't want to speculate madly. So I used what I knew, and from what available in her books, the tone of voice, the language, the issues that she's talked about, etc. And this character was born then.
Well, Juby John wrote in to say what was the process that went into writing Eating a Wasp. So Juby, I hope that answers your question there. But as a former journalist and a museum professional, research has always been such an important part of the things that we do. And as a writer, I'm sure, it's the kind of skeleton on which you flesh out the whole story. So I really wanted you to talk a little about the research that you've done, say, for the whole story on Mistress, Kathakali, chain of...
Yeah. No, it's not just, Mistress is when with the first novel, when I wrote Better Man, I didn't need research because I was living, in that area. I just had to look outside my door and it was there. Or think of the stories I'd been told about my village and it was all there. With Ladies Coupe, it was observation mostly. Except when I had to write about a chemistry teacher. And I remember sitting, one of my colleagues again at office then, at the advertising agency then, very sweetly, a chemical engineer who had given it all up to become, an advertising person. He found me some textbooks, his chemistry, BSc chemistry, or not his textbooks, BSc chemistry textbooks. And I started reading them. Not that I understood much of it, but I started reading them. And at some point, the poetry of chemistry kind of, seeped into me. And that became an integral part of one of the main stories of Ladies Coupe. But when I knew I was going to write about Kathakali, all I know is that I've always loved Kathakali music, but I didn't understand a word of it because at that point of time, my Malayalam wasn't very good. I mean, speaking Malayalam was great, was fine, but I couldn't read very well, etc. And I knew nothing at all about Kathakali. So, like I said, Shornur, this nearest railway town that I disembark at, is very close to Kerala's premium Kathakali Institute. Okay. So I decided to go there, enroll as a short-term student because Kalamandalam, that's the organization, doesn't allow full-time female students. So I had to enroll as a short-term female student. And it wasn't that I wanted to learn Kathakali. I mean, I just wanted to understand it. I wanted to be part. I wanted to immerse myself in it. So research for me is pretty much immersing myself in that world. In some instances, I can physically do it. In some other instances, I need to kind of read and look at maps and pictures, go to museums, do whatever is necessary. In some other instances, like I have a book called Alphabet Soup for Lovers, which has got a lot of food in it. I have cooked every single dish that I have written about in that book.
Since you're talking about Alphabet Soup for Lovers, I really wanted to come to this whole food that is an element that keeps popping up in your stories, because Ladies Coupe ends with a whole series of lovely recipes. And Akila's mother, in fact, when she's talking about, it's also, there's also a subtext to the food. The food plays a role because it's almost as if she uses her cooking to create this web of control. She controls the relationship. Only she will cook for her husband. And, she sort of isolates them in that little cocoon. Again, your character, Margaret, with Ebenezer, she is this woman who's bullied and humiliated by her husband. And so she uses food as her weapon, she feeds her husband and reduces him to this obese mass of flesh who becomes ineffectual and so protects herself. So tell us what's going on here with the food.
So, well, I think, food, see, it's like I'm somebody who likes everything about food, the cooking, the prepping and the cooking. And, I kind of like sometimes wake up in the morning with a recipe in my head of something that I want to try that day. So food is really something that I'm very passionate about. And I'm a traditionalist. So I like to do everything the way it was always done. I'm not into fusion cooking. I don't like fusion food, etc. So I think in many ways, food is like the tangible projection of my personality in that sense, where what I believe in is also what I like in the food that I eat, or the alcohol I drink, or the juices I drink, or whatever. So I realized that when I'm so passionate about it, somehow it has a way, it's like, when you're passionate about something, it has a way of sneaking into everything that you do. So I found that even with The Better Man, which had, very little room for food really, I found a recipe coming in. I mean, not a recipe, but a dish being described, etc., and so on. And as I, grew older and my writing, prowess, I would call it, became much more surer, I realized how I could use food as a technique, as a tool to enhance a scene, to create a character, to destroy a character, to use as a bedrock for a story, etc. So in that sense, it's an ally. It's like the way I would probably use poetry or the way I would use music, I use food in my writing.
Yeah, it's quite incredible actually, because sometimes it has this very positive, delicious kind of aura to the whole thing, and then sometimes it almost turns malevolent.
Yeah, it
So,
does.
quite interesting to hear that. Okay, there's another question here from your culinary interest as well as your love for animals, cats. Musa or Idris's companion Makanto, for instance. So tell us about your love for pets.
Okay. So the things that I cannot live without are animals, plants, and music. Pretty much anything else is fine. But if I need to be with animals around. In fact, I prefer them, to be very honest, I prefer them to people. At any given point of time, I'd rather be with animals than the two-legged ones. So I guess that again starts making an appearance in all the all the books that I wrote. Like in the first couple of books, yes, there was no place for animals, because I was still finding my feet with what I could use in my writing. But I realized that when I started writing for children, that this child in me who is what draws me to animals, that there's a very kind of innocent love that animals are capable of giving you, which humans can't really. I'm not saying animals can't be manipulative and diabolical and all that. They can be very wicked too. But there is still something about them that is very, very unconditional in that sense. You can kick an animal and it'll still come back to you, especially a dog or even a cat. I know cats are much maligned creatures. But I live in my garden. We used to have about 13 cats. Now, sadly, they've been reduced to about 5 or 6. I live with 2 giant dogs, and I'm not referring to my husband or son, but I am referring to 2 dogs, real dogs that I have. And I find what I get from them is so amazingly divine that, again, I feel the need to bring this into my writing. So when I started writing, when I decided to write the Quran stories, and I was like, how do I bring these stories out without offending anybody's sensibilities? And so I said, and the Prophet always had a cat apparently. And there are many stories in Islamic folklore about the Prophet's cat. And so I said, let me take the Prophet's cat and use him as a character. And the jinn, baby jinn that he talks to, there's a subspecies of jinns called jans. And one of the forms that they can take is a white camel. So this baby jinn appears as this white camel. So animals, and similarly, when I was writing about this dog in Idris, my dog had died and I was really missing her. And so I needed to, write a dog into the story so that it could kind of work for me in terms of how I consoled myself.
I remember even I was reading up and I saw how the squirrels had inspired you to create little stories for your son.
Mhm.
And that's when you started off the whole children's series.
Yes. Because we had just moved into this apartment at that point, he's now 28 years old, but then he was really tiny. And we moved into this apartment which had a garden. So he wasn't very happy with it because, he has this very vivid imagination and he kept seeing things. There was a giant avocado tree and he used to think that it had faces in it and I don't know, this was pre-Game of Thrones, but he still had that kind of a, imagination. So just to kind of get him to fall in love with the place that we had moved into, I created this character called Nunu the skating squirrel and started telling him stories about this squirrel. And that eventually became a book.
Okay, I'm sorry, we're going to be backing and forthing all over the place, but I've seen a question now regarding, when you were doing your research, say for Borigauda, and the interactions that you had with the police and how you try to do your research for that. I found that quite an amusing story. Why don't you tell us a little more about that?
Oh God, I don't know if I should. I have to write more Gouda stories and I can't give away my sources. I can't, I think I'll have to pass that question because this is like, public space and really. But what I can tell you is that what I can tell you is that, we are so used to perceiving the police force as the good and the bad. We never understand that actually they live in this gray area and they have a lot to deal with. They have a lot to handle and I'm not saying everybody is this wonderful, noble human being or nor is everybody this dark, villainous creature, so so that was my understanding, but I really don't know if I can talk about my research into the, because when I do still have other books to write and I don't want avenues closing in my face.
No, could you tell us a little more, in fact, about how you were researching chain of custody and the trafficking of children there?
Yeah, that I can. So, the thing again, like with chain of custody, why I wrote that book was I remember picking up the newspaper one morning and there was just a random news article about various people who have, various children who've been kidnapped only in Bank. I'm talking of only Karnataka. And they had the number of children kidnapped, the number of children who'd been traced, and the number of children still missing. And this was just for 1 year. And the numbers were quite staggering. I can't tell you that offhand now because I don't have my notes with me. But it was quite staggering. And it was also very worrying for me. And I just decided that let me try and understand this better. So I started going online and I found these various organizations, NGOs, etc., who did work with trafficking and especially of trafficking of minors. And the first set of people that I talked to was the Bosco organization. And they have these volunteers who position themselves in railway stations and bus stands. And they keep an eye out for, they by now can figure out who is what and whether the child is on his own or on her own. If the person with them is a family member or somebody who kind of brought them over, etc. So I started off by hanging out with those people, just would go to the station there, be with them. And I need to tell you this now, for instance, I used to go every Thursday. And I live in the Hennur side, so I'd go to the city station and it takes me about an hour and a half even then, and I'd go there, be there till about 2 o'clock in the afternoon because there are no long distance trains coming after that time till about 6 in the evening. So till about 2 o'clock I'd be there and I'd come back home and I couldn't eat, I couldn't drink, I couldn't even drink water because I would feel so overwhelmed by what I had seen and I wouldn't be able to speak to anybody. And then those days, this was the summer, and we had power cuts and our UPS had conked out and it was, it hadn't been replaced. So what we would do was that we had a smaller UPS. So my parents were visiting at that time. My parents and I would be sitting in the dining room, one light, one fan kind of situation. And my mom would say, like, so what was your day like today when you went there? And then I wouldn't be able to stop talking because everything that was there in me would just come out, and I would describe the children and all of it. And I realized that this was just the edge of the iceberg, and where do you go? And then I started talking to various organizations, various people. I met the police officials. And, it's like for every 10 children they rescue, there are 100 to 200 children who just go under the radar. And they try and organize raids, they rescue children. I met a couple of rescued children. I spoke to them. I went to the girls' home. I met all those girls there, and I met various boys in the boys' home, etc. And the story was the same: poverty. The family has no way of dealing with the poverty, so they sell what they have, and finally it comes down to the children. So trafficking is a problem of our economic condition rather than anything else. It begins with that, and it was a book that broke me, really, writing it, because the depravity of humanity is very, very evident when it comes to what these trafficked children have to go through. The kind of because most of them end up as bonded labor. Not most of them, they end up either as bonded labor or as sex workers, underage sex workers. And the kind of things that they're put through, because somehow we like to believe that all forms of sexual depravity happen only in the Western world, and India is kind of free of all these things, which is all nonsense, because pedophilia is as big a problem here as it is elsewhere. And yeah, so it kind of broke me, that book, really, the research part of it. And even writing it was horrendous. As a writer, what I had to go through to imagine everything that these children had told me about, and some of those things they hadn't told me about, but I had to read between the lines, etc.
I know, it's just so difficult to imagine what they've gone through. If I, as a reader, and you as a writer, can feel so gut-wrenched, difficult to imagine what those children actually went through, who actually went through that experience. So Anita, we are almost to the end of this conversation. So I wanted you to tell us a little about what lies ahead. What are you working on? What can we expect to look forward to?
So I am working on the next Gowda novel at this point. I have 2 children's books to do. And I'm also going to be editing an anthology of writings on Banaras. So that's 4 books that I need to do in the span of a year.
Okay, so that's quite a lot that's coming.
Yeah, it's a lot of work.
When can we expect the first book to come out? You have
so now there's a bit of uncertainty about publishing dates, etc., because of the pandemic. So I'm hoping end of the year.
Okay, great. So thank you so much, Anita, for talking to us, for being so generous with your time, with your insights. We're really looking forward to what you have next for us. And I'd also like to thank our audience for logging on to us and for listening to this evening's conversation. We cannot wait to be in touch with you in person, but we have to make do, and we have to be positive about the situation that there is, because at least it allows us to reach out to other on a virtual platform. Because MAP now has a whole series of programs, all its education programs, its lecture series had come to a standstill. So we're so happy to be able to collaborate with the BIC and put this all out on a public platform. So we are all still engaged in some sense or other. So thank you so much for being with us this evening. It's over to you, Raghu.
Thank you so much, Kamini. Thank you so much to the Museum of Art and Photography. And thank you so much, Anita. Do join us for the next session as part of the same series, our collaboration with the Museum of Art and Photography. Same time next week on Saturday, it's a conversation between the dancer Malvika Sarukai and author Indira Chandrasekhar. And tomorrow, we have a very interesting discussion called Talking South Asia. It's a conversation between the popular Pakistani musician Ali Sethi and Ambassador Nirupama Rao. So thank you.